Okay, so three panelists, three excellent panelists, may I say. And as always, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and in a couple of minutes tell them why we should pay any attention to them whatsoever. Technologies, and we'll plunge in. I'll ask the first question, and after that, it's up to you. There's not a whole lot of people here, so you're going to have to ask questions. All right.
Good evening. I'm David Scanlon.
Actually, let me do my one thing. I should hold your microphone closer to your mouth than you think you should, because even I don't do it. The people can hear it. So. Yeah, particularly for the TV. So.
I'm David Scanlon. I'm the Deputy Secretary of State for New Hampshire. I've held the position now almost 18 years, and boy, that time has flown by. Prior to that, I served in the legislature for 8 terms or 16 years. So I have experience both being on the ballot as a candidate and also in a position where we produce the ballots, distribute them, and prepare them for the election cycle.
I'm Tiani Coleman, and I'm a non-practicing attorney at the moment. I'm also president of New Hampshire Independent Voters. And speaking of Utah, I used to be the chair of the Salt Lake County Republican Party out in Utah, where we use ranked choice voting in our conventions out there. So I've been familiar with ranked choice voting since early 2000s and became a big fan of it back then. And now here with New Hampshire Independent Voters, we've also started a group called New Hampshire Ranked Choice Voting, and we are advocating to get ranked choice voting passed here. We've had a couple of sessions where it's been in 2018 and 2019 sessions. It's not in the session this year in 2020 because we're working really hard to set everything up this year so that it will pass in 2021.
My name is Kyle Bailey. I live in Gorham, Maine. I'm a political consultant. I ran the ballot measure campaign that won ranked choice voting in Maine in 2016, and the ballot measure campaign that protected ranked choice voting in 2018 in the ballot box. And then 2019, last year, led the legislative campaign that won ranked choice voting for presidential elections in Maine. So Maine is the first state to adopt ranked choice voting for state primaries and congressional elections. We had a ballot measure campaign to save that law when the legislature repealed it. And then last year, we expanded that law to include presidential primaries and general elections, the first state to do that. So I'm glad to be here for New Hampshire and see something happening.
You people are incredibly efficient. The regulars will know we've never had all three of them introduce themselves. All right. Well, let me start with the first question, which I will ask of Deputy Secretary of State, which is just for background. Explain quickly about kind of how elections currently run in the state, how the ballots are created, printed, distributed, collected, and counted. Quickly.
Well, the role of our office, obviously, is to prepare the ballots. We start with a filing period where all the candidates that are interested in running for office sign up. And I'm talking about state-level races, although a similar event occurs in local elections as well. After the filing period closes, we start preparing the ballots, and as long as I've been in the Secretary of State's office, I've seen ballot styles change, and there are events that occur that require changes on the ballot. Examples of that might be, a dozen years or so ago, we used to list all of the candidates' names just in straight alphabetical order on the ballot. So if your name began with A, there was a good chance that you were going to be first in the list of candidates. Through a court case, we had a court ruling that said we can't do that anymore because it's not fair to the person whose last name begins with Z, always going last. So the court instructed us to rotate the names, the order of names on the ballot. And so we have a system for doing that where each candidate has an equal opportunity to be chosen as the first name on the ballot, and then subsequent names following in a certain order. The court also required that in a general election we have to rotate party lines on the ballot as well. So every town or every city board has a different ballot. And the order of names are not the same on those ballots, and the party column rotations are probably not the same in each ward. We use a local printer where we print over 1 million ballots for a state election every year, every election. In a party primary, we're actually printing 2 ballots because there's 2 elections, one for the Republican Party and one for the Democratic Party. And if there were another party, like the Libertarians have been, then there's a good chance that we will print a primary ballot for them as well. New Hampshire has a ton of candidates. We're probably have more candidates per capita than any other state in the country. So our ballots are somewhat complex in that regard because we have to find the space to do that. We believe strongly that all of the candidates on the ballot should be listed on one page, and we shouldn't have to flip the page over to vote. Obviously, if there were certain changes made, that might change. Ranked choice might be one of those options. Other issues that other items that might change that, if there were minor parties that actually became official parties, so that instead of just Republicans and Democrats, we also have Libertarians, Green Party members, Constitution Party members, that would dramatically change the ballot format. So, in terms of ranked choice voting, I'll probably get into this discussion. That's one of the concerns that we would have in our office is what would the impact be on the voter's experience, what the ballot would look like. Do we have equipment that can actually count a ballot that has a ranked choice option on it? And those are all pretty significant concerns from our perspective. Our office doesn't really have a position on this bill. We do have a degree of skepticism. It is a new concept. To a lot of people, it is foreign. And when it comes to elections, our goal is to keep things as simple as possible for the voters so that they have a ballot that they can understand. And if we're going to train election officials and voters on the use of it, we have to be able to explain that process and what's going on in a simple way.
Can you talk about how current ballots are counted?
Right now, ballots are counted in New Hampshire 2 ways. First of all, every ballot that is cast in New Hampshire is cast on a paper ballot. And historically, ballots have been hand counted in New Hampshire up until probably 35 years ago, when first there were some lever machines which rapidly went out of existence because they were unreliable. Today, we use an aging optical scan counting device, which is a local option. In other words, the city or town has to decide if they want to use that type of a device to count the ballots. Roughly 2/3 of the cities and towns in New Hampshire use an optical scan counting device. That represents probably about 80% of the population. The other smaller towns have trouble justifying spending the money on a counting device that might be in excess of $8,000 plus programming costs of the memory card for every election. And when they just have 500 or 600 or 1,000 voters, it's kind of hard to justify that expense.
I live in a town with hand counts still. Does anybody else in here do that hand count? Okay. And my wife has volunteered. I always work on election nights. My wife has volunteered a few times. And it's an interesting process to hand count ballots on election night with a bunch of nearsighted neighbors. So yeah.
And I would just follow up. After the election's over, New Hampshire always has recounts in the state election. We conduct by far more recounts than any other state in the country, and we do every single one of those recounts by hand. We don't use another machine to count the ballots. We make sure that we see the intent of the voter on every ballot and count the ballot that way.
And the ones that aren't hand counted, optical scan, that's AccuVote or something.
The AccuVote optical scan counting device is the only machine that's approved for use in New Hampshire. Some of the ones that are in service now are approaching 30 years old. They've been pretty reliable, and there is a new generation of digital scanning devices now that are on the market. There's a lot more computer code in them, and we do have a certain segment of our population that is very suspicious of what happens in those machines when it's the machine counting and not the excuse me, and not the workers in the polling place.
I think you can safely say we have a segment of the population that's very suspicious. Yeah. All right, okay, I think that's all I need for the background. So, yeah. Absolutely.
This is just.
Actually, I forgot to say. So let me. If you got a question, wait for the microphone for the TV folks. It's not wireless today because we have some technical issues. So as I mentioned, you folks in the corner, you might have to walk over here. I'm not sure I can get the wire all the way to you, and/or I might trip myself.
Okay. Hi. I was at a meeting last night where we saw samples of the Republican and the Democratic primary ballot. And we were all frankly shocked at the number of people in both parties. We had no idea all these people were running. It was incredible. You mentioned, essentially, it's drawing from a hat or some sort of a random selection for the first person on the list. My question is actually, we were wondering how you decided the subsequent placement. You mentioned that there was an order. It was kind of, I was wondering where you were going there. What is that?
In the federal offices, and the presidential primary ballot it falls into that category. We actually rotate the names on the ballots around the state so that each candidate appears in the first, last, and intermediate positions as equal a number of times as is realistically possible. So with 33 candidates on the Democratic presidential ballot and 17 on the Republican side, each candidate on the Democratic side is going to be first, not quite 100 times. It's not really even time. Yeah, so that's how that works.
So they're rotating. You've got them. Yeah, I got it.
Yes.
Across.
Now the ballot for each polling place is exactly the same. The ballots are not different within the polling place, but Ward 1 in Concord will have a different rotation than Ward 2 in Concord, and then you carry that out within the state. The reason that there's so many names on the presidential primary ballot, and this is one of the reasons why New Hampshire has the first in the nation primary, and why we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of that on February 11th, is that it is very easy for a candidate to have their name placed on the ballot. And it's really one of the few places in the country where that fourth grader that has the dream to go up and be president, if they carry that through to 35 years of age, they can actually try and make that happen. And the requirements to be on the ballot simply fill out the Declaration of Candidacy that states that you meet the requirements of the U.S. Constitution, 35 years of age, or a natural born citizen of the United States, and you've lived in the country for 14 years. And they pay $1,000. And if they can do that, their name will appear right next to Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or anybody else.
Or Vermin Supreme.
Vermin Supreme is not running in either party this year, so
are you kidding? No, I didn't know. We noticed that
actually obtained the Libertarian nomination for, I don't know if it's governor or president, but he's running as a third party candidate, so there's a different process for that.
All right. Okay. Other questions? We start here while he's close.
Just a quick question. How often do the optical scan ballots not match the hand count? Is it pretty accurate?
They're actually very accurate. Yeah. And whenever we do a recount, there are usually slight changes in the numbers. And the reason for that is if a voter marks the ballot in a way that the machine will not read it, but the moderator or the person counting the ballot can determine the voter's intent, then that ballot gets counted. So it will be, it'll show up as an extra vote.
I can actually help answer that. As a reporter, several elections ago, there was a recount in one of the flotarial districts that covers multiple towns. And one of the towns was hand counted and two of them were machine counted. And actually this happened in two districts. And in both cases, the number of ballots changed was higher in the hand counted town than the machine counted town. Which obviously is not statistically significant, but it was an indication that, as my wife has seen, when you're 11:30 at night and counting ballots, it's hard to be perfect. So, all right.
I think I got an idea how ranked choice voting would work when there's one candidate. There's several places in New Hampshire, say for example, where I live, the top three finishers get elected to our House representative. How would a ranked choice vote work then?
Well, there are actually different methods for multi-member districts, but one method is called the single transferable vote method. It's actually quite different than regular ranked choice voting. Regular ranked choice voting is based on majority. The person who gets the majority of votes wins, or the person who gets the most closely to the majority.
Actually, does everybody know roughly how ranked choice voting works, or not at all? Is there anybody who's completely clueless about it? No, not at all?
Okay, so I'll backtrack. Okay. So ranked choice voting in general works the same way as you would vote normally. You just go in and vote. Normally you would vote for one person. That would be your first choice in the ranked choice ballot. But then you get to also say, if there are more than two candidates, you get to also say who your second choice would be, who your third choice would be, and so on. And then the way that it's counted is that when they count the ballots, if the first thing is count everyone's first choices, they don't pay any attention to second and third choices. And after they count everyone's first choices, they tally it just like they would in a regular election. And if one of those candidates got a majority of the vote, then they just say it's over. But if nobody gets a majority of the vote, meaning nobody gets more than 50% of the vote, then what they do is they eliminate. So it's like an instant runoff election. It's a runoff election, but it's done right there. You don't have to come back for a new election. And so what they do is they eliminate the bottom candidate who got the least number of votes. So they're considered eliminated. And then they do a second count. And in the second count, everyone's votes still count for their first choice if their first choice is still in the race. But the people who voted for the eliminated candidate, if they were counting them again, if you were voting again, you wouldn't be able to vote for someone who's not on the ballot. So they don't count your first choice anymore because your first choice has been eliminated. So then they go to your second choice and count your second choice. So it's just like a runoff election, except that you're able to do it on one ballot. That's how it normally works. Now, in a multi-member district, like I said, it would be different. In a multi-member district, what they do is call this, they can do it other ways. Sometimes they do it other ways, but one way to do it is to do a single transferable vote, where they're kind of doing the opposite. They're saying, okay, if somebody already got elected, if someone already got enough votes that they got majority and they got elected, then they have a bunch of excess votes. And the people who voted for them, their votes kind of being wasted because they've been excess. So they can then count their second choice to see who they want. And that usually results in more of a proportional representation, actually, rather than majority. So if you have three representatives, instead of having three who all represent the majority view, you might get two who represent the majority view and one who represents the minority view. So it makes it more evenly distributed. It's a different thing.
Does everybody understand sort of how ranked choice voting though works? Okay. Can I just go at it?
Absolutely, please.
Just a different way too, real quick. So let's say Tiani and I are running against each other in an election, and it's just the two of us, right? And so we run a campaign. It's a spirited race. We all go vote. And on election night, the votes are all counted, and I get 60%, or let's say I get 40% of the vote, Tiani gets 60% of the vote, right? But suddenly, this gentleman decides to enter the race, and he and Tiani are very similarly aligned politically, right? And so what ends up happening is that they end up splitting the vote. Their supporters and each other are very like-minded, right? And so what happens is, I'm over here with my 40% of the vote. People who are behind me, right? But what ends up happening here is that they end up dividing the other 60% of the vote, so that one of them gets 35% of the vote, and the other one gets 25% of the vote. So what happens? I got 40% of the vote. I win the election, even though 60% of the voters clearly wanted to go in that direction. So that's what can happen under a first-past-the-post plurality system, the way that we've typically voted for a long time, or most places have voted. What ranked choice voting does is says, wait a minute, do people really want the guy who got 40% of the vote to win? So with ranked choice voting, you get a chance to say, in this race with three candidates, so in this race, there's no, I can't waste my vote for Tiani, or, he's not a spoiler. Those dynamics go away. You get a chance to say, she's my first choice, he's my second choice, or she's my second choice, he's my first. You get a chance to rank your choices in order of your true individual preference, right? From your favorite to your least favorite. And what happens on election night is we count all the votes to see who is your favorite choice, right? And so think about it as piles of ballots. So if your first choice is me, right, all those ballots are piled up in front of me. Your first choice is Tiani, all the ballots are piled up in front of her. Your first choice is him, all the ballots are piled up in front of him. And so I've got 40% of the vote, she's got 35% of the vote, he's got 25% of the vote. So what happens is no one has a majority, and he's in last place, so he's eliminated, right? But if you voted for him, your vote's not wasted. We literally pick up the ballots to see, for the folks who voted for him as their first choice, who's their second choice. We pick up the ballots and we move them to the pile for their second choice. What happens? Almost everyone who ranked him as their first choice moves over to Tiani, right? And suddenly, she now overcomes me. She gets a majority of the vote and wins the election. And if you voted for her or I as your first choice, right, your vote still counts for us. It's still sitting in that pile, right? In that instant runoff, in that second round of tabulation. So it's just as if you had everybody come back to the polls and vote all over again without him being there, but you didn't have to do that because you knew exactly what people would do based on how they ranked their choices. Does that help?
Well, that helps in the,
Sure,
the
one winner, right? Yeah.
Can I just say, I actually saw that so when I ran my fake election, which I did with all 16 candidates who at the time were the leading candidates, which I've since been told is not the way, you would only actually do 10. But anyway, whatever. I had 16 different piles out on the floor of the publisher's office, and was not allowed into our office for a couple days. And literally, I'd go, well, this person's lowest. I'd pick them up and I'd walk around and distribute them and count again. And perfect example of what you just said happened between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, very similar supporters. When Bernie Sanders got eliminated, when he was the lowest, after about 10 rounds, 12 rounds, virtually all of his votes went to Elizabeth Warren, so she jumped up quite a lot. If you're interested in this sort of thing, very few of Elizabeth Warren's voters chose Bernie as their next choice, so I don't know what that says about the vote. So you can analyze the heck out of these things. But anyway, but it definitely, you could definitely see she jumped way up in the rankings and did much better than she would if it was just one vote. So. Are you all right?
I have a follow-up.
I'll be in there.
Sure. This is directed toward Sadie. Okay. I'll ask the same question I asked you before. Why don't they do this with the New Hampshire primary?
That has been proposed, but the reason why I think it's a bad idea for the New Hampshire primary is, if you think about it, presidential primaries are to allocate delegates and send them to the national convention. And so when we have so many candidates running in New Hampshire, there's an opportunity for several of those candidates to get delegates. The requirement in New Hampshire is you have to get more than 10%. And if you do that, you're eligible to get a delegate. And the number of delegates that you can get above that depends on the percentage of the vote that you get. So if you applied ranked choice voting to the presidential primary, with the goal being that you move the winner above the 50% threshold, even though the plurality might be less than 30%, to the extent that you're moving a candidate up, you're moving candidates that have qualified for delegates down below that threshold. And that's...
So we had a bill this last session that was specifically geared towards implementing ranked choice voting for this upcoming presidential primary this year. And we worked really hard to try to get it to pass because we thought it was very, very important that it passed because of the delegate threshold of being 15% in the Democratic Party and 10% in the Republican Party. Then that means that if you have a whole number of candidates, a lot, which we have, in 2016 we had a huge number of Republican candidates, and this year we have a huge number of Democratic candidates. And in both cases, you might have a majority or if not a majority, at least a large number of votes that go to candidates who got less than that 10% or 15%, and therefore it's like your vote is completely wasted. It does not go towards anything. And so we had a system for using it in the presidential primary where you did not go to the final candidate because we knew that in a presidential primary it's used just for allocating delegates. And so, you don't have to go till you get to the final candidate. You can go until you get to all candidates remaining have at least 15% of the vote or 10% if it's the Republican Party. And so that way, if you have 4 candidates that each have 5%, or 4 candidates who each have 14%, or however many candidates, and you add all that up, that's a huge percentage of the vote that's not going towards any delegates, that's completely being wasted. If we had been able to implement ranked choice voting, so many more votes would have been counted. And in the Republican Party this year, for example, at the moment, when you look at the polls, it doesn't look like, there's a huge amount of challenge. But what happens is you kind of have the Trump vote and the anti-Trump vote, right? But all the other candidates represent the anti-Trump vote. And so, it's possible that all those candidates combined might equal at least 10%. But because they're splitting the vote, probably none of them, unless something changes, probably none of them will get 10%. And so it doesn't accurately reflect the will of the voters.
Well, you answered my follow-up question, which was, given that you have an algorithm for ranking, determining a second place, third place, and so on, wouldn't that answer your question? Using ranked choice voting and allocating delegates?
You don't have to decide policy here in front of the TV camera.
I'm not going to decide policy, but New Hampshire is, I'll say, special. I think we all in this room know that. And the reason is that the eyes are on our state after the Iowa caucus is over. I mean, we're on the state now, but there's a really intense focus after the Iowa caucus is over. And it's a race. I mean, elections are also called races. And so, there's a bunch of candidates running down the track. And the one that crosses that wire first wins. And then there's a second place finisher and a third place. And typically they get trophies. And the same is true in New Hampshire. The results are known at the end of the night. They claim victory or claim they're the comeback kid. And then they move on to the next nominating event. I think you can make arguments that you're hearing here, that you really count the votes properly, but there's more happening in New Hampshire that is important to the rest of the nation. I mean, it's having a winner that it's not going to change. It's having a second place person that can claim that they made a comeback. and they can move on to the next place and make their event. If you go through a process where, the person that clearly came in first, by 4 percentage points on the night of the election, isn't the winner the next morning because of the way the votes were recalculated, I think it does something to that process that it may not be beneficial.
All right, then another question over here.
Hi. Who does the tallying of all this? In Concord, we don't count our ballots unless we absolutely have to. If the books match the tape, which they usually do, we don't have to count ballots. We know how many ballots were cast. We know how many uncounted ballots. So now the people that have got there at 6 o'clock in the morning, and now at 7 o'clock at night, 7:30, now they have to start counting ballots.
So my understanding is that there are digital scan devices that can count and determine the outcome of a ranked choice vote, and I think they use them in Maine, and it worked. As far as New Hampshire goes, though, I did check with the vendor that services the machines in New Hampshire, and I mentioned that the machines are aging now; they're 30 years, and those machines will not accommodate a ranked choice ballot. So if that was the direction that New Hampshire decided to move in, then we would have to make available counting devices that would accommodate the ranked choice voting.
That's an interesting revelation because that's not what came out in the hearings. I have not personally verified that, but we have someone who has been doing ranked choice voting for a long time who said that he went and looked into the machines that are being used in New Hampshire and that they could be used. They did require a small software upgrade, but it's a free software upgrade that's available now, or a very minimal cost. So it's not a really big change to be able to make them able to be used in a ranked choice ballot.
Yeah, I would say with there's about over a dozen cities now across the United States that are using ranked choice voting, including some major cities, and of course Maine is now using it, and there are 5 states that are using it in their presidential primaries and caucuses this year. So because it's becoming more popular, all the biggest vendors of election tabulators and systems have now integrated ranked choice voting into their systems and have those software upgrades available. So not that there wouldn't be a cost to the state of New Hampshire to upgrade those systems, but I think in Maine, I think we paid $35,000 for the entire state to upgrade the software for our existing tabulators. And we had tabulators with ES&S, a different vendor that were easily upgradable. So that was the cost was very minimal to us. But those are all things that have to get worked out with the election administrators in each state.
Excellent. Let me go back over here, and then I'll go right across. Actually, in terms of dollars, just quickly, I talked to the state, the Maine Secretary of State's office, and their estimate for ranked choice voting for a general election is that an election in Maine costs, they'd say, $350,000 to $400,000. And add another $300,000 or so for ranked choice voting. So it almost double it. But most of that cost is printing a separate ballot. So what they do is they print one ballot for the races that are just first past the post, and another ballot for ranked choice voting. If you go onto the Maine Secretary of State website, there was a webinar that he gave about a year ago talking about it, and he says one of the things they decided was whether they wanted to print just one ballot with both ranked choice and non-ranked choice, and decided that would be confusing to them. So maybe they wouldn't need that cost necessarily. But they had to run a high-speed tabulator, and there's some software, and they have to transport materials because for statewide races, you have to bring them all back to one place in order to determine. In Maine, right? But you would also, but you would here too. For so right now you can determine who won. In Congress and the whole district by just adding up all the results from each town. But if there were multiple candidates,
Not true. I
voting,
can disprove that.
We're gonna get all mathy here. I feel like I'm getting going. So be careful. So the ranked choice voting, that may not be true if there's not too many candidates. You might have to bring all the ballots to one spot. So that's an extra amount of cost.
It's way easier to do in New Hampshire than Maine.
You have to go to Fort Kent for crying out loud.
I will just say that the actual cost to implement ranked choice voting in Maine for the June 2018 election, which included the initial implementation cost, the one-time cost, the Secretary of State of Maine has an affidavit saying it cost $89,000 to implement ranked choice voting. The fiscal note that was originally assigned to our Citizens Initiative, the Secretary of State assigned to our initiative, said it would cost $1.5 million to implement ranked choice voting. Our Secretary of State also traveled around the state during that campaign and was on the radio and different events saying it cost up to $10 million in 10 years to implement. So this is the sort of thing that one of the challenges we faced in our state, but the true cost actually ended up being about $89,000. And that was not inclusive of all, I think, the cost the Secretary of State would have liked to have spent on education. So we provided a lot of education. We were able to go to some foundations to provide private funding to do a lot of education. The state did very little education, voter education around ranked choice voting, and yet voters were overwhelmingly found that ranked choice voting was easy to use, and they didn't have to report any problems. In fact, the Secretary of State talked to reporters after both elections saying that voters didn't report any problems using ranked choice voting, did not hear any issues from clerks saying that there were problems. That was very easy to use, and that was actually with very little voter education, because if you've looked at a ranked choice voting ballot with a couple of rows and a few columns, it's pretty intuitive. And that's because I tell folks we rank choices every day of our lives. You know, if I go to the ice cream shop and I want chocolate ice cream and they're out of chocolate ice cream, you know, I don't freak out or walk away. I know what my second choice is. I get strawberry. Right? We rank our choices every day of our lives. It's how we operate as human beings, and if we can make that with everyday choices, with the things we eat and the cars we drive and where we want to go for dinner, we pretty much do that with politicians too. So, yeah.
There is a sample ballot of the Maine election there that can be passed around if you want to take a look at what it looks like. It's not terribly complicated. Much less complicated than what I put together in the paper. So, you over here, yes.
I'm actually town moderator for Dunbarton, which is 2 towns over. We have 3,000 inhabitants, right now about 2,100 voters, and in the last presidential election, 1,700 of them did vote, which were about 80%, and we hand count. And so I'm not sure it's a question or a comment about the nature of change. I can't imagine how we would hand count those ballots. We were there till 3 in the morning the last presidential election. We would be there for days.
Well, so let me tell you what we do in Maine, and then the others can talk. So in Maine, because we do central tabulation with ranked choice voting, at the local level, nothing changes for clerks and the local election administrators. So you're just counting on election night, first choice rankings, and that's what you report to the state. And then the ballots get, just like you would in a recount, the ballots get boxed up and sent by the state police or courier service, deliver them to the Secretary of State, and they have a high-speed tabulator that they run the ballots through to process and be able to do the ranked choice voting tabulation. So that there's no more work on local towns.
One of my town clerk calls me in curmudgeon because I won't let go of hand counting. But part of why I don't want to is what it does for the community. There's not a lot that pulls a big area, small population town together: the school, the elections, and getting people to stay and count the votes. It becomes kind of a social event. We bring in snacks. There are people who volunteer every time, and I would hate to lose that. It's good to know that there'd be a way to do it without having to.
And most of our towns are hand count towns in Maine too.
Thank you.
Right, and I would also just say that if you are hand counting a relatively low number, not like 1 million, but 1,500 ballots, which is relatively low.
Doesn't look like it on.
Not at 3 in the morning.
It really doesn't. The ranked choice process doesn't take it much longer, really, than the first process. The first process takes the longest, counting that first choice vote that you do anyway all the time. Because what you do is when you count them, each time you get a certain person, you make a pile for them. So you have a pile of everyone's first choice votes. And so when you have to count the second choice, if nobody got a majority, if someone got a majority, it's over. You don't have to count any other votes. But if nobody got a majority, all you have to do is take the smallest pile of person who was eliminated and count for second choice. And a lot of times it will pretty soon go to the winner. Sometimes it's so close with a lot of candidates, I guess you could go many rounds, but it may not take more than just a few rounds. The longest time period is counting that first initial vote that you do already anyway.
So my 16 candidates in my fake one, I had to go 14 rounds. I had to do all the way to the last 3. But that was weird. That was irritating. And realistically, I suspect that even if New Hampshire got ranked choice, it would be a long time before we got it at the local level. So, and if it's not at the local level, then my wife and his volunteers don't have to worry about it. That's really what it was looking for. All right. Before I ask a question, you have Matthew on that.
Not yet.
So I'm the guy who had that letter published in the Concord Monitor saying that the ranked choice system should not be used for the presidential preference primary because it is a preference primary. So, and the argument that Mr. Scanlon gave against using it was actually a very weak argument, as you heard. The idea of it's about allocating delegates, you just say, all right, well, we'll only do it until such time as everybody who's left has a delegate. That's not the real reason you don't want to have ranked choice for presidential preference primary. The real reason is because New Hampshire's significance is much more about sending a message than about some actual numerical results that result in the choosing of one president ultimately. And we don't know ahead of time how many so-called tickets out of New Hampshire there are, because more than one person can exceed expectations. And if someone who's currently got high expectations does poorly, like, let's say using current numbers, if Elizabeth Warren does poorly, that may open up a hole such that Tulsi Gabbard coming in 5th, she is so much higher than her expectation that we say she got a ticket out of New Hampshire. It's not so much just us, it's the political establishment. In other words, it's within the Democratic Party making that decision of how many people came out of the New Hampshire primary. It's not something that we have a known threshold beforehand. So we just want to give those numbers, here's the top preferences, here's the next preference, and leave them there and let people look at them and decide what's going to happen in future primaries.
Can I say something to
That wasn't very quantitative for a math guy.
I would say that I really think that ranked choice voting gives a much clearer message of what the voters want. If you have 2 candidates, let's say, because in the polls leading up to this particular presidential primary, up until just very recently, they were all showing that probably only 2 candidates in that long list of 20 could surpass the 15%. And that meant all the other candidates were split up all the rest of the percentage. So only, 30% of the vote or so was going towards 2 candidates. So a huge percentage of the vote was not. So only 2 would get delegates. That just kind of says, okay, these 2 got 15%, but it doesn't really say at all what the voters want. Whereas if you use ranked choice voting, you start to see, oh, well, this person who's in top, everyone keeps wanting them. So they really clearly are at the top because all the other people that are at the lowest, people want them. Or it might show the opposite. It might show that 15% is their sealer. And so they're not going to get very much further because all these other people, that's their last choice, and they all want this other person. And I think it really makes it much more clear what the voters of New Hampshire want And since a lot of other states are now moving towards using ranked choice voting, I said a lot, but it's starting to happen with a few, and it will then be more. If New Hampshire doesn't adopt ranked choice voting, we're going to start being insignificant. We're going to lose the power of first in the nation primary, in my opinion.
Okay. So my question was for the gentleman from Maine. I'm just curious, like what we were, because you've dealt with it for a couple of years now at an increasing rate. What would you say were your like top 2 positive things that have come out of it? What was 1 or 2 negative things? And these were things that you weren't expecting or that got reinforced. And was there anything that was like a real surprise that you had no idea was going to happen that now you've seen because you've been doing it for a couple of years? So what would your response be to that?
A couple of positives. So we saw higher voter participation, particularly in the first time it was used in the primary election. Maine has consistently been among one of the top states with high voter turnout in general elections, but we've also been one of the states that's had one of the lowest rates of voter participation in primary elections, and in fact some of the lowest voter participation rates in the nation, some historic lows in statewide primary elections. So we had massive voter turnout in our primary election in 2018. We actually had the Secretary of Towns actually photocopying ballots at the municipal level, which actually delayed our tabulation of results for ranked choice voting because the high-speed tabulator couldn't read the photocopies and had to be hand counted. So that was pretty exciting to see, and ranked choice voting was really a driver of that. And I would say because the voting system, and this is sort of, I'm a political scientist as a student, but I don't think voting systems necessarily drive increased voter participation or turnout, but I think that they enhanced democracy. So what I mean is that ranked choice voting accommodates competition in a healthier way, right? So when you have ranked choice voting, it sort of levels that playing field. It gives you as a voter more choices, and you can express your truer preferences about a candidate, rank them. There's no spoilers. There's no vote splitting, right? So candidates are freer to run. It sort of levels the playing field, and what that does is it's empowering, right? And so maybe voters who maybe stayed at home before because they're the kind of candidates they liked get labeled as spoilers and never win and da-da-da, so why would I go vote? They're sort of empowered to re-engage in their democracy, so it invites people to participate. So we see that across the country with ranked choice voting. So that's one. I will say that I saw candidates reach out beyond their base and appeal for second choice rankings. I saw that in the primaries, but also in the second congressional district race in Maine. The candidate who ended up winning this last time around, he beat an incumbent congressman. On election night, he came in, he was in second place. The winner in that race ended up just behind. He was in second place. Neither candidate had an outright majority. There were 4 candidates in the race, and the third and fourth place finisher got about 10% of the vote between the two of them. And the gentlemen who were neck and neck in the mid-40 percentile, one of them refused to ask for second choice ranking, said ranked choice voting is stupid, only ranking me as your first choice. And the other one said, reached out to the voters who voted for one of the third-party candidates and said, I hope you'll rank me as your second choice or third choice if I can't be your first choice, and really reached out to those independent third-party voters. And as a result, by a 2-to-1 margin, voters who voted for one of those third-party or independent candidates ranked that individual as their second choice, and he ended up overcoming that incumbent and beating him in the instant runoff round of tabulation of ranked choice voting. And I would say that individual who ended up winning just ran a campaign that was more, I would say, more civil, more geared towards reaching out beyond his base, appealing more broadly for support, et cetera. And so it proved, and we've seen this in other places too that have ranked choice voting, if you're willing to, the incentives change. You know, instead of sort of trashing and burning and mudslinging, you know, as a candidate, that doesn't serve you well for attracting second and third choice rankings from voters who like another candidate better. So those are quick positives. Really quickly, any negatives?
Hold on a second. Can I, before you go there. Sure. So what was the reaction to the supporters of the guy who didn't win and who was ahead on election night? Because I know this has been an issue in some place. People think, it's a gimmick and you've stolen the election.
Yeah. It's the same reaction you see in other places where that same thing happens, is that's who their opposition ends up being. And so we have some opposition from that individual who ended up losing the race, and from some of his supporters who just soured grapes.
Yeah, but it didn't end up being, I don't know, a legal issue or anything like that. I mean, so, I mean, like, the perfect example is Burlington, Vermont, which had it. This happened, and everybody said, "What the heck? We didn't want this guy to win," and so they threw out ranked choice voting.
Well, there was a special election and narrowly lost, and they're about to put it back on the ballot again because it's so popular to bring it back. But and there was a lawsuit. This gentleman filed a lawsuit after he won, challenging ranked choice voting on every single U.S. constitutional issue, and he lost in U.S. District Court, and the Circuit Court for the First District agreed with the U.S. District Court. So on federal constitutional grounds, every court has upheld ranked choice voting as fully constitutional. So, I mean, this is what you find of ranked choice voting from a negative perspective, and this is, to me, so interesting. Everywhere ranked choice voting has come up, where opponents have been, in some places it's been Democrats who oppose, in some places it's been Republicans, in some places it's been labor unions, in some places it's been, business groups. It varies on who thinks that they have something to win or lose from changing the status quo, and who's in power and who's not. And so in Maine, when we started running our first campaign, the folks who had more power than not tended to be the folks who were more opposed from a partisan perspective, from an ideological perspective, and that's just where it is. But the first campaign we won, we got support across the political spectrum. It's these reforms, especially ranked choice voting, is a nonpartisan reform. It's a nonpartisan reform, because in Maine we had 9 of 11 governors elected without majority support, and 5 of them had one with less than 40% support, which is sort of what brought about the conversation about ranked choice voting. And of those, we had 6 governors who won without a majority in a row. 2 were independents, 2 were Democrats, 2 were Republicans. So it was really, for us, a conversation about, okay, what do we want for our political process, not about helping one party or the other, or independents for that matter.
Any surprises in the final part? Was it like something that happened that no one figured or no one thought about?
The biggest surprise for me, was the fact that the voters approved ranked choice voting in 2016 by the second largest referendum vote of the people in Maine's history. And then 1 year later, the legislature turned around at midnight and repealed the law.
So what you're saying is maybe the party bosses don't like it.
I mean, some people in both parties don't like it.
Well, all the parties.
Yeah, the powers that be don't like it. I mean, we had allies in both political parties, for sure, but there are folks who don't like it and will fight it. But it has to be, what we found is that it has to be a people-powered movement that wins over the politicians, because you're the constituents.
Yeah. And what was so amazing as well in Maine was that after they did that repeal, the people rallied again and passed it again, and then they used it, and they passed it while they were using it, and then they were able to get the legislature that had repealed it to pass it the next year for the presidential election. So they liked it so much they just kept expanding it. So that's a really good sign. I know you have a question, but I just wanted to say real quick too, back to the other question about the candidate who thought that they rightfully won because they came in first on the first ballot, but then the other candidate who was in second overtook them, right? And this can happen, a lot of times in a ranked choice ballot, the person who came in first to begin with stays in first. But sometimes they don't stay in first, they get overtaken by the second choice. But I think in the cases where the second choice or the third choice or whoever ends up overtaking the original first choice, rather than saying that that person stole the election, I would say that in our current system, where we have so many people winning in those instances, they're the ones stealing the election because they are winning without a majority of the support. They're winning because they're getting other people. In some instances, they are literally purposely putting other candidates in to split the vote. In some instances, they have nothing to do with it. But either way, some other candidates are splitting the vote, and they're winning by, in a sense, stealing the election. So ranked choice voting makes it better. Yeah.
Can I just say, in my my mock ballot, the guy who came in first on the very first count, through all 14 came in first at the end. So I spent several hours for no purpose at all. And also in terms of the surprises, so this is the Maine Secretary of State, his webinar, they were asking about it. He said, I like this. He said, one of the things that came up, we had a high-level state official. This is after they'd done their first ranked choice voting primary. High-level state official came up and said, we don't have ranked choice voting for governor, but he and his wife swore that they voted by ranked choice voting for governor. I don't know which ballot it was for. Because they voted by absentee, we had the local office poll about, so we can expect them. They did, took them out of the envelope, put them in the new envelope, and they were fine. He said, I guess we're crazy, because they swore they granted choices for governor, but they hadn't. That was the power of suggestion. People who swore they got the wrong ballot. So, because I'm talking about it, they heard a lot of complaints, but they were never able to find any other complaints about it. Power of suggestion.
I just want to say also that even though your first place stayed in first the whole time, I wouldn't say that it was for naught. Because in a real race, it's very powerful for, it makes a lot fewer complainers who don't like who won or whatever, because in the end, they're able to see that that person who won really won, and then they can really govern. So.
Okay, who hasn't asked a question yet? You haven't. I'm advocating for all.
You were talking earlier how Maine had a very low, basically turnout, and I believe New Hampshire is, David can speak to this, I believe New Hampshire is ranked consistently like in the top several, 2, 3, with a single day voting. Am I correct in that?
Yes, New Hampshire consistently ranks near the top of the states in just about any election, but Maine historically has had very high turnout as well.
Okay, so talk about low, but we go
in some statewide primary elections, like gubernatorial primary elections, things like that, not general elections. General elections are very high.
Okay. But the other thing you talked about, when you had done your mock vote,
yeah,
and you'd gone through 16 people, 14 rounds, some of those people, it's their 13th choice. So I don't know that I'd be one. I know you're not going to have that same thing where you're going to have so many people. But I don't want to go that far down. To use sort of an ice cream analogy, Arnie's will be open in a month, up on the heights. But you talk about if there's one ice cream that's not available. For me, I'm going up there. I like basically all of them. Which one am I going to choose? I'm not going to be able to take a little bit of each one. So for me to be voting, to make all that, there's some people that I'm just not going to vote for.
And you don't have to.
Right, no, but it just, when you have that many different choices, and I know it's usually only going to be, 3, 4, 5. I'm the moderator in Chichester, and you talk about making it simple. It's amazing the ballots that we've had to eliminate because, for a state representative, it says pick 3. And they're marking 4, 5, or 6. So I cannot judge their intent. So some things you think are very simple, but for years it's been the same exact thing.
in mine, out of, I forget the numbers exactly, like 400 votes, people mailed in ballots, and by the end, about 35, 40 of them were not counted at all, because they didn't choose everybody, and all the ones they had chosen had been eliminated, so. And only about a third of the people made a choice for all 16. So it's excessive.
Yeah, I just a quick thing, a couple things to share real quick on that. What we find is we have two things. There's a lot of self-reported data from voters about the ease of use about ranked choice voting, but one of the cool things that I've found looking at elections across the country where ranked choice voting is used, including Maine's experiences, there's something called the spoiled ballot rate, which is all right, how many ballots aren't actually counted because there's something wrong with the ballot. What we find is that in ranked choice voting elections and in non-ranked choice voting elections, the spoiled ballot rate is actually comparable, meaning that there's really no difference in terms of the number of ballots that are thrown out, which tells us that not only are voters saying it's easy, but in fact, there just seems to be no real difference between the plurality elections and ranked choice voting elections in terms of the voters having problem filling out the ballot, which I think is really interesting. And the other thing I'd say, I mean, yes, you can rank as many or as few candidates as you like. In some places that have ranked choice voting, you can rank up to 3. Some places you can rank up to 4 or 5 or 6. In Maine, you can actually rank as many as you want, depending on how the Secretary of State designs the ballot. In Portland, the first time they used ranked choice voting in Portland, Maine, it's 17 candidates. It looked a lot like your ballot, actually, for mayor. And I think something like 85% of people went all the way through the final round of tabulation. But I'd also say, I think that, if you're voting, let's say hypothetically you're voting in the Democratic presidential primary this year, you probably have an opinion about Joe Biden, you probably have an opinion about Bernie Sanders, you probably have an opinion about Elizabeth Warren, and maybe you have an opinion about Pete Buttigieg. I think those are the top 4 polling candidates. So as long as you're ranking at least 3 of those, then your ballot's going to count. And if it was ranked choice voting, your ballot would count to the final round of tabulation for somebody, right? So the odds are, right, that even if you get a crowded race of ranked choice voting, you could rank as many as you wanted. The likelihood is that you're ranking somewhere in your rankings, even if you're only choosing to rank a few, are the candidates who've spent the most amount of money, have the highest name recognition, are the candidates who are ultimately going to make it all the way through because they are the most well-known, have the highest name recognition, right? You're going to probably, in your rankings, rank someone who is the most viable candidate who's probably going to make it all the way through, even if you decide not to rank, all 15 candidates sort of thing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I've heard ranked choice voting described in several different settings, here in the paper, elsewhere. Beginning to settle in, I'm beginning to understand what it's about, and that's fine, but I'm also wondering, okay, my neighbor doesn't read the paper, probably hasn't heard about it. How do I talk to him about it? Do you have anything in writing that says, this is what it is, like 3, 4, 5, or 10 points, and this is why we should put it in place in New Hampshire? You've given a number of reasons, but is there anything in writing that we can use to explain about that?
I brought a little handout, although I'm not sure it's 100% the best. But if you go, there are a few different websites you can go to. If you want to get involved in helping ranked choice voting, sign up for the Facebook group, New Hampshire Ranked Choice Voting. If you want to be educated about ranked choice voting, there are a few different websites, but the easiest one to remember is fairvote.org. Maine had some great websites. Massachusetts is doing a huge campaign. It's going to be on their ballot this November, whether to implement ranked choice voting. So they have some great stuff on Voter Choice MA, and yours is
rcvmaine.com.
Yeah, rcvmaine.com. Yeah, but fairvote.org has a lot about ranked choice voting. That's an easy one to go to.
That's fair as in F-A-I-R.
Yes.
Not paying money for it.
Yeah, F-A-I-R. vote.org.
Okay. I'm just curious if any of the states that use ranked choice voting actually just do it by, say, averaging the ranks or summing the ranks. So you don't have to constantly go through this reiteration over and over again. In other words, you just, if I had 5 people who voted for me and 1 person, 3 of them voted me first and 2 voted me second, we would average those together. And if I ended up at the lowest ranking of all the people who were in, I would win. You know what I'm saying? Just average the ranks. Or you sum them, because if people leave some off, I mean, that would be a problem. You know what I'm saying? You have no idea.
I know what you're saying.
Just
I mean,
instead of playing the game.
there are some other methods of tabulating votes, and I think there's one called STAR that kind of does something similar. It's not exact average, but they have assigned points to the different rankings and whatnot.
Yeah.
Some of the drawbacks is just that it's actually more complicated to explain and for people to understand and to tally and all of that. And it hasn't been used anywhere widespread in any way whatsoever, so there's not really any data on it. Ranked choice voting is easiest because it is basically the exact same as regular election. It's like doing a runoff election, but yet you do it all on one ballot, so it's not so complicated. It's a lot easier.
I'm wondering whether in the situation where you have, say, 27 candidates, and I can envision 27 class, if it would simplify the tallying procedure to ask people, instead of ranking each candidate on a scale of 1 to 27, if you said, give me your top 5 or your top 7 or whatever would be an appropriate number, would that somehow simplify the tallying, number one? But would that also end up being less fair because the lower tier is going to be dropped off soon?
Yeah, I mean, if you limit the number of candidates that people can rank and you have more candidates running, you're going to have more voters who ultimately may not, in their rankings, have a candidate who is in the final round of tabulation, right? So they may not make it all the way through the final round of tabulation. So when you limit that opportunity to rank, then you limit the option for that voter to sort of make it all the way through. Is it more democratic than a plurality system? Sure, because when you have 27 candidates running and you have pick one first past the post, someone can obviously win with 9% of the vote, right? Which is a problem. So it's obviously better than not. But I'd also say that once again, as I said before, if you've got a lot of candidates running, there's probably a Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Pete Buttigieg in the mix who are polling towards the top and are going to attract more votes. What we do in Maine, look, the reality is the most candidates we've ever had run for governor, I think, is 5 in a general election. We had 3 this last go around. We had 3 before the time before that. We had 4 before that. So we were really adopting ranked choice voting in our state to try to accommodate an existing challenge, which was the fact that we had 3, 4, or 5 candidates in a general election and upwards to 6 or 7 candidates in a primary. And so I think that's probably the most common scenario in most states. I mean, some states have 3 or 4 or 5 candidates in a primary, maybe 3 or 4 candidates if you factor in independents or third-party candidates in general elections. So that's what this reform is really about, is about giving voters the opportunity to express their true preferences about candidates in those races where you've got, a half a dozen candidates or so, especially at the state legislative, congressional level, et cetera.
And also, I talked to a ranked choice voting guru, Howie Feld, who has indicated that in most cases, 10 will usually accomplish 10 even less can often do it, but 10 almost always accomplishes what needs to be accomplished. So usually if you can at least bring 10, you can, most voters will be able to end up with their final guy in the trial. Not everyone.
As a follow-up, same questions and issues.
So you raised a point of interest. If you have a primary election, say 7 candidates,
Closer.
and some of those candidates, or one of those candidates is going to go on to the general election, would the scenario, could a scenario be that the top 3 finishers in the primary are then continued in the general election, and then you would have a re-ranking, or things that you're taking, so obviously things don't work that.
Well,
In other words, our primary is always winner take all?
no.
Louisiana.
Right. If there is such a thing as, for example, Alaska has a ballot measure right now. It's called Top 4. And so what they're doing, what Top 4 would do, would put all the parties together in the same race. And so then that would be the primary, just like California and Louisiana and all those. California, Louisiana, Washington State, and some races in Nebraska do that currently, where they put all the voters together in the same, all the parties together, so the Democrats, the Republicans, Independents, Libertarians, Greens, everyone's in the same primary.
Irrespective of party.
Right, it's kind of like a nonpartisan primary, except people are allowed to have a party, but, or at least anyway, they're allowed to express what their preference of party is. And so then in some of those states, they have what's called Top 2, where they just take the top 2 to the general election. But what Alaska's proposing is that they take the top 4 and move them to the general election, and then they use ranked choice voting in that general election.
Wow.
There are other things that can be done besides that as well. There's different things that can be done where they could have more than one from the primary go forward. But no, in most primaries, it is just one.
Okay. Question here, over there.
Yeah, I've had time to brew on my question here, so I've got a couple of comments before I get to the question. One thing that I would like to make a comment on is that since I'm going to take a wild guess and say that Trump's going to get 42% of the Republican vote, just because that's pretty much what he's been his entire Republican vote. I'll say he'll get way more. All right, whatever. I would really, really like to know what the representation would be if we used ranked choice voting in the remaining 58%, or whatever the percent is. I want to know if Bill Weld gets a significant batch of votes, especially because many of the Republican primaries have been canceled. It matters what New Hampshire says. There are a lot of reasons that, in addition to that issue, it matters. New Hampshire's first in the nation primary status is and should be challenged, in my opinion. We're not representative of the country. We are, our demographics, we're not representative of the country. You know that. And if the people in the tiny little state of New Hampshire who have such power in this first in the nation retail primary, and I do think there's value in a retail primary. I do think there's value in it. But if they realized that their votes, how many of their votes are being thrown away and not even going to count for a delegate selection, they would be really pissed. Seriously, I don't think people understand that. People don't get that. We need to help people understand that. And so here's my question, David. Can you help us, as a reporter, identify after the election?
Not him, David. Oh.
No, you. After the election, can you help us identify this issue of lost votes, people that were just dismissed, not counted at all in delegate selection? I mean, is this going to result in, I don't know, do the delegates get selected on a county-by-county basis? Is that how it works? And if it's county-by-county, then does that mean that certain entire regions of the state of New Hampshire are being thrown away?
No, it's statewide, isn't it?
So is it a statewide thing? How does that come down? I don't understand the mechanics and what the final result, it doesn't matter really. I mean, one means that a geographic region could be discounted. Another one means that X number of people are being discounted. Either way, it matters. Because in our tiny little non-representative state, we're only being represented by a tiny little handful of people. That's not okay. That's all.
So Dave, don't tell your boss what she said about, us losing the first primary. He wouldn't like it, so. I don't know, any comment you want to make about that, or, so the lost vote, obviously, argument is part of what you've always been saying.
I've already mentioned it. I'm not sure if you know. I'm not sure if I follow exactly what your question was in addition to what I've already said. But yes, I mean, if Dave doesn't, I will write an op-ed about what happened and people who lost their vote because we didn't use ranked choice voting.
So, talking about, although of course our motto is no politics here, which is hard to do with this topic. So the reason I did not do a fake ballot for the Republican primary is because I assumed Trump would win on the first ballot and it would be useless.
Plurality.
So he would no, he'd get a majority of the first ballot. Within the Republican only primary, so that's just a problem. So.
Yeah.
You want to say something?
Well, I just want to address how the delegate selection process works in New Hampshire. So each party has so many delegates that they have in New Hampshire that goes to the national convention. And when the candidate files for office within a short time after that, each candidate is supposed to provide to the Secretary of State the pool of individuals that they would choose as delegates, depending on how many they win. So you have the election, the candidates, say that there's 3 or 4 that go over the 10 or the 15% threshold, depending on the party. The delegates that exist for those candidates that receive less than 10% of the vote go to the winning candidate as kind of a reward for coming in first. And then those candidates will choose from their list which individuals will actually go to the convention, because the list that they supply is based on if they won all the delegates.
Isn't it proportionally distributed? They don't all go to the winning candidate, right? It's proportional.
Each candidate that receives, depending on which primary, more than 10 or 15% of the vote is assigned delegates based on the percentage that they receive. But there's always there's a couple of delegates left over that represent the collective group of candidates who receive less than 10%. And those delegates, you can say there's 2, but then assigned to the winning primary.
So if you had 7 viable candidates, in theory they could all get 14%, and nobody would get any delegates. That make sense? Okay. Questions? Anybody who hasn't asked one yet? You quiet people over here on this side of the room, come on.
This question only applies to me. Why do you need primaries?
Because we have ranked choice voting. Why not just have a general election with ranked choice voting with whoever the hell wants to run?
That's what I meant.
Got it, yeah. So, good question. So our initiative kept party primaries, but applied ranked choice voting to them, and then used ranked choice voting in general election. And we did that because the conversations that we'd had through the coalition that we had built was that people wanted to keep enough people wanted to keep the party primaries. They liked participating in the party primaries and having that as a vehicle to organize and to they liked having the political party process. and they wanted to utilize that. And so the conversation was to use ranked choice voting in that process to encourage healthy debate and competition and to level playing field in the primary, and then to have that same opportunity in a general election to allow independent third-party candidates to also have a level playing field. So the argument was sort of that it's a win-win for the parties and independent third-party candidates. So Democrats and Republicans, this was a political argument to some extent for us in Maine, and so each state is different, has to decide what's best for them. But from our perspective, it was some might argue that if we had just said we're going to do away with the primaries or not address the primaries and we're just going to focus on the general election, some might have said, oh, this is just about helping independent third-party candidates in general elections to help them try to win. And so we applied it to primaries in part because the argument was, well, ranked choice voting in primaries helps the parties to put your best foot forward. Because, for example, we had a 7-way Democratic primary for governor this last go-around. The winner of that primary went on to win the general election for governor, but she got 35% of the vote in the first round, but she ended up winning with 53%, 55% of the vote after with the ranked choice voting result. In the primary. And so the primary showed that she was in fact a consensus winner, when in fact I think if we hadn't had ranked choice voting in that primary, there's probably some, she's a more moderate Democrat, so there were probably some progressive groups that might have said, raised fury that she was, sort of stole the election with 35%. You could sort of see those factions emerging, and so ranked choice voting was this sort of nice consensus process for the parties that benefited the party and parties, but then the general election also leveled the playing field for independent third-party candidates. So we sort of liked that, thought that was well-rounded for me.
And just to add to that, there are some people who do advocate for just having one election because they say it's cheaper. You don't have to have primaries. You can save money now that you have ranked choice voting. You just need to have one election. And if that's your goal, then that's an argument. Personally, I think we do benefit from narrowing the list. We benefit whether it's done through parties. I personally am not much into parties. But even if we were to combine the parties, which I would like to do, meaning what I mean is to have one primary, because as an independent, I like to be able to vote both. If I go into a state ballot, I might want to vote in the Republican side for governor, let's say, and on the Democratic side for Senate. I'm just making that up, but I'm just saying, I want to be able to do both, but I can't. I have to pick one party or the other, even though I'm an independent. So I personally would like to just combine them all, but I would still personally want primaries because I think it's beneficial to have a lot of candidates and then narrow it down to fewer so that people can really focus on a few candidates instead of having to focus on such a huge number of candidates.
Next one. I forgot who was somebody had their hand up? No? Well, you throw this up. Well, let me, so in my column today, I talked about a professor from SUNY Buffalo who I invited here, but oddly enough, he didn't want to drive the convent. And he made an argument, he and a colleague had done some analysis, and he made the argument opposite of anything I've ever heard of, which is that ranked choice voting is actually more divisive, and the plurality, first past the vote, unifies it. And the idea being that ranked choice voting is sort of like, turns you into like the legislature in Italy, where there's 500 different parties, all sort of squabbling amongst each other, because so many people will participate because they might have a chance of getting some of the votes, and so it actually ends up splitting things more. Whereas when under the plurality system, whereas you've got it, the argument is you've got to get enough people, so it will be fewer viable candidates, and therefore people can vote. A, have you ever heard this argument before? And B, so if you disagree with it, how would you respond? Ranked choice voting, anybody and their grandmother can come out and run with the possibility if, I get all these third place votes, I might actually win. Whereas it's not going to happen. Actually, what would you say to this professor driven here from Buffalo?
Well, I guess I would say that, the overwhelming majority of political scientists and political science research says that ranked choice voting is a far preferable voting system to first past the post and plurality voting. That it has proven to have a modest increase in voter participation as a result of its implementation. That there is a correlation with more civility in campaigns. That voters do express more empowerment. That the notion that somehow people of color can't rank their choices or elderly voters aren't able to express their opinions about more than one candidate in an election is just not accurate. These are some of the arguments that we've seen from some people against ranked choice voting. But again, there's about 5% of political scientists and political science research that says ranked choice voting isn't a good political reform. And so I think that's up for everyone to read the research and decide what you think about the different voting systems and what you like. Larry Diamond is probably one of the world's most renowned experts on democracy at Stanford University at the Hoover Institution. He is a great author. If you're not familiar with his work, I definitely check it out. He has helped to write constitutions for some of the world's developing nations, and he is a strong voice for ranked choice voting. Lee Drutman from New America Foundation is a great scholar of democracy work. He's written extensively about ranked choice voting. Caroline Tolbert is another professor at the University of Iowa who's conducted a number of different research studies about ranked choice voting. Others have as well that show these correlations. So you can go online and find some of this research, and you'll see a couple of professors who've written some research in opposing ranked choice voting as well. Just like you can go online and find some research that says climate change is not the result of human activity. But the overwhelming majority of scientists say that humans do cause, and the climate change is driven significantly by human activity. So you can try to find science on both sides. So that's what the research says, and that's what I'd probably say to that gentleman.
From a personal point of view, I've been writing about this topic for probably 20 years because it just fits into the Granny Geek, it's funky, weird, and cool. And yeah, it's geeky. And initially I thought it was not a joke. It struck me as a classic geek response to a problem. You've got this complicated sociological problem, so I'm going to change the mechanism because that's easy to do because I don't want to deal with human beings. But in the last probably couple of years, I've actually probably changed my point of view. I do think it would have a dampening effect on some of the more toxic aspects of democracy. It would be far from panacea, and there'd be many other things that still need to be solved. I think it would be a step. Plus, it'd be fun.
Can I just say something about that too? Because I agree with you. I don't think ranked choice voting is a silver bullet by any means, but I do think it's something that we can do to improve the process. It's sort of a window that's open to us to make it better, and I think the way I look at it is, our founding fathers sort of gave us this republic if we can keep it, and part of that challenge is to make our union more perfect. And I think with each generation, we have a responsibility to strengthen our democracy and find ways to tweak it. You've got to pop the hood every once in a while and tune her up. And so this is how I see ranked choice voting as sort of a tune-up on the car and making sure it lasts and that the kids and grandkids have something good to drive forward. And that's sort of how I look at ranked choice voting is making sure that we leave the kids something good to drive forward that's going to get them where they need to go next. Okay?
I was just going to say something.
Yeah, please.
I think that we have had a political system traditionally that really doesn't have a huge amount of competition. If you look back through history, we used to have the party bosses kind of picking the candidates, and incumbents used to really just have a ton of power, and sometimes they'd have a little bit of challenge, right, but not very much. But I think we're kind of coming into a new era now where people aren't really accepting that as much anymore. People want to have more competition, they want to have more power from the ground up. And I think with that kind of desire of people wanting to have more competition in the political system, we need to have a system that accommodates that, and that's ranked choice voting.
I'd like to go back to your earlier description of one of the alternatives when you have multiple candidates that need to be selected, and you talked about taking the so-called excess or the wasted votes for the number one candidate. That's something that I've heard about for many years, and it worries me that there's room for hanky-panky there. The way you described it, literally, it would be the people who vote earliest in the day would have a much higher probability that their ballots would go to their second choice. So can you talk more about, is there some shuffling or some way that you can negate that?
She's talking about multi-member districts where you're not just electing one person, but you're electing more, like we do in the House for many state house races for the state house. Kyle, did you want to say something about that?
Well, I was just going to say that, there are a couple of cities in the United States that use, it's called proportional representation.
Yeah.
So when you use a ranked balloting for multi-member districts, and there's some videos online, and it's something that I had to watch the videos a few times to sort of understand it. And some countries use PR, proportional representation too. There's some videos called Animal Kingdom on YouTube you can find, and they show you, I know this is, if you have to sort of geek out about this if you want to go watch it, because there's several different ways to sort of do this, but if you have like 10 minutes sometime and you actually care to go watch it, if you go YouTube, Animal Kingdom Proportional Representation, it shows you the different ways in which, and through like animals, like Little Kingdom thing, it's a cartoon thing, but they show you like basically how does like New Zealand and how does other countries like elect their parliament. So most of these are sort of parliamentary systems, which the United States is probably unlikely to use because we're not a parliamentary system. But basically, what the gist of what multi-member district with proportional representation is, it says that, hey, Massachusetts has 12 members of their congressional delegation, and they're all Democrats. But 30% of people in Massachusetts are registered Republicans. Shouldn't a third of the members of Congress in Massachusetts be Republicans? So why don't we draw the congressional districts, instead of being one member of Congress per district, why don't we put 3 members of Congress in each district so that we have 4 districts of 3, right? And that in each district elects 3 members of Congress, and we use proportional representation so that 2 of them are Democrats and 1's a Republican, so that Massachusetts sends 3 Republicans and 9 Democrats to Washington, D.C. to represent the state. That's the gist of proportional representation, that basically says, just because Democrats have 70% of the votes in a state, well, Republicans are still 30%, so shouldn't they have some voice? Or vice versa, if a state is the flip, and 30% of voters are Democrats and 70% are Republicans, shouldn't Democrats have a couple of seats and voices as well? Shouldn't you get some representation as well? That's sort of the gist of proportional representation. It's sort of seen as being maybe the truest form of democracy and representation, but it's a little more sort of confusing, I think, for us, because we don't sort of structure ourselves in a parliamentary way we're not familiar with sort of structuring our elections in that way.
All right, so what about my question of how do you neutralize the potential is an unequal distribution of the second, third, and lower choices among the people who had that first choice that was declared the winner, so such that the excess is distributed equitably?
Okay, just first off, it's not done like in order. It's not done like the first people to the polls, they start counting them, and then they say, oh, this person's already won, so now
No, they count all the ballots at the same time, just like they always would. And unfortunately, this is not my forte, so I'm not good at explaining it. But it works in such a way that they count everyone's first choice, and then once someone, so the people who have a majority have already been elected.
Well, wait,
And-
okay.
It's about political.
You put every single ballot in a pile for its first choice.
Right.
You don't stop for any pile just
No.
because that pile's sufficiently tall.
No, it's just
Okay.
it's the same as what we
Yeah,
already
okay.
what I've already explained for one when you elect one person.
Right,
Right.
okay.
You count everyone, and people that have a majority get elected. Right.
And so now there's a pile that is 3,000 ballots taller than it needs to be to declare that candidate elected. Which 3,000 ballots do you take out of that pile to redistribute?
It's not, right, I'm not an expert on proportional organization either, but it's not about picking up ballots and moving them around. It's about percentages of vote and it's about percentage of vote share. And if the top candidate gets 40% of the vote and you only need 33% to win, then they have an excess of 7%. And it's about looking at that. It's about taking that 7% over the line and considering that as excess vote for their party.
You need
So
a
it's
more
about parties.
precise definition of that 7%. Can you say you take all the entire stack and get proportions of that stack and take a proportion?
It's not about individual ballots. It's about percentage of vote, and it's about political parties to making sure that there's fair representation.
I think it's the, I watched the video, yeah.
It's tough to explain.
It is done by mathematical formula, but I will say this: in our bill, we had a provision for that for multi-member districts. I think the bill that's coming up in 2021, we're not going to be doing that yet. Or it would be a separate bill. It wouldn't be the same because it is somewhat of a different concept that needs to be considered separately, and also because of a provision in the state constitution. So we're going to be focusing on other races at first.
Single winner races.
In 2021, yes.
We're getting near the end here. If we want to geek out, we can talk about Arrow's theorem, which is says basically there is no perfect system, right? Ken Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, partly for that work. And some people, including myself, many years ago, looked at that and said, well, that means that we shouldn't try using any alternative system. But we won't. So, we'll just really have another question.
I just wanted to let everybody know, my understanding is ranked choice voting is used in other areas. One of the big ones coming up very soon is Academy Awards. Not for all of them, but for Best Picture, they use ranked choice voting when everyone gets to vote. So pretty cool that it's not just in politics, somewhere else too.
There's some professional organizations that use it as well, right? Journalists? No, they're not. I said professionals.
Curious of whether and how much, if at all, ranked choice voting is used in other areas, other nations, other areas of the world, that sort of thing.
So Australia has actually used ranked choice balloting since 1917 to elect its lower house of parliament, so long before tabulators. Ireland uses ranked choice voting to elect its president. It actually does it by hand, counts all the ballots in the country by hand. Cities around the world use ranked choice voting, including London. There are a number of countries that use ranked choice voting to elect their president. And so a number of political parties around the world, conservatives and liberal and labor parties in Canada and Britain and other places use ranked balloting. And then some of the other voting systems we talked about tonight are used in various forms around the world, some with ranked balloting, some with other types of balloting. So there's a lot of different voting systems that are used in places that use ranked choice voting, either for multi-member districts or single-member districts. So very common around the world. It's actually the system that we use, which we inherited from Great Britain, is we're definitely in the minority of nations that use we call it first past the post. It's only a handful of nations, mostly that were colonial nations of Great Britain, a handful that still use this version and don't have some sort of a runoff or majority system in place, if not a parliamentary or ranking system that gets to more better representation.
Sort of like not using the metric system. So, yeah. And if you're familiar with Australian politics, you will realize that ranked choice voting is not a panacea. All right, well, actually, one last question. Make it real quick, since you haven't asked any.
Extremely quick. I just wanted to mention that the video you mentioned of the Animal Kingdom, that's actually a series, CGP Grey with an E, on YouTube and on his website, cgpgrey.com, titled Politics in the Animal Kingdom, and it does go over a variety of approaches, including the difficulties with first past the post.
Great, okay. All right. You gonna be quick? Real quick. Let this work.
I'm curious as to how ranked choice voting will work and whether it is actually used in nations which have a very low literacy rate. Does it exist at all, for example, in Ethiopia?
I'm pretty sure they use ranked choice voting in India. But I can't tell you that I can rattle off the statistics of exactly how that works. But I do know that it's been found in all of the polls that they've done that it's very easy to use and very easy to understand. So,
isn't this a chance to make a Maine joke?
Wow.
If you go online and look at a map of voting systems, I mean, it's Canada, the United States, Great Britain that have the sort of first past the post systems, and every other country where that's majority black, brown, yellow, whatever, uses some sort of system that we would all say, ooh, that's complicated, right? Like, I mean, the rest of the world that is developing or lower income, less educated, has less access to educational institutions, that we would consider, that it's not an OECD country, right? These are all countries that use proportional representation, have parliamentary systems, use ranked balloting, have multi-member districts. I mean, these countries and people participate, and in some cases participate at far greater levels in their democracies than we do here in the United States. So maybe something we should look at.
and also that in the UK, even though they traditionally use first past the post like we do, a lot of their cities and whatnot are now using ranked choice voting, as is Ireland as a country. So they're changing. Oh, and also I just wanted to say to you that fairvote.org that I mentioned at the beginning, not only do they have good information on single-member ranked choice voting to explain that and to have bullet points and all of that, but they also have good information on the multi-member district elections that explain how it works, so if you want to understand that better.
And I was going to say, if you're on Facebook, if you go to find the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting on Facebook, we post pretty regularly interesting news articles, clips to different things. It made me think that there's a great website that Britain has called the Reform Society, that they post the results of Great Britain's elections that actually show the fact that they actually have had only twice in the last 100 years that there's been a majority coalition in Parliament that's been representative of a majority of voters in Britain. So what usually happens is a political party gets 40 or 45% of the vote, or even less, and they actually get a majority of seats in Parliament. So there's a real disconnect because of this first past the post thing. It's not representative.
Do you want to say any last comment, or are you?
Just want to thank you for hosting this. We've enjoyed this discussion and talking with all of you. I think that this is an interesting topic, and I've learned some things tonight. It represents change to our voting system, but I think the 50,000-foot climate of elections in New Hampshire and around the country is change that goes beyond just this subject. Things like all mail voting, no excuse absentee voting, automatic voter registration. There's a whole host of issues that are out there that are pushing up against New Hampshire right now. And so I think we have to seriously look at those things, but carefully consider them before we actually take a step to make sure that, whenever we add new changes that they're coordinated and that they will all work well together in the future. And I think that's going to be a pretty big challenge moving forward.
When you said all mail voting, I thought you were going to rescind the 19th Amendment. All right. So please join me in thanking our panelists for giving us their time. Thank you for showing up, and tell your friends to show up, because that's not one for people to buy their food, or else they're not going to give me the free room anymore. So next month, as I say, the topic's going to be science fiction, and sciencecafenh.org is the website as always. Sign up for the newsletter, and if you're on the newsletter and or looking at my blog, you will see I will say when Concord TV puts this online, so you show it other people.
The first email I got said like February.
Yeah, I messed up the date of the
Maybe I'm just saying that might have been.
Get a handout.
Yeah, come on. Thank you.
Hey, and be sure to thank this guy, because I can tell you from experience, election administrators work really, really hard. You have no idea how much work they do. So be sure to be thankful.
But everybody loves that.